Welcome, everybody, to our third In Dialogue event here at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. We have a great panel with us today, some in person, one virtually, and partly this event has been organized to mark the release of this new book, which marks the culmination of a major research project here at the Institute, titled Civil Society Organizations and the Challenges of Migration, Agents of Change, which in German has its acronym as ZOMIDI. This project investigated how German civil society organizations have changed in response to migration and diversification. With us today are two of the project team and contributing authors to the book, Sanja Bukla and Vanessa Rao. Sanja's work explores the challenges of intersectional advocacy among LGBTQI organizations. Prior to joining us at the MPI, she worked for many years as a social justice and diversity trainer and founded an NGO for political education. Meanwhile, on this project, Vanessa has worked with a disability-focused organization, examining how disability intersects and interacts with other forms of difference. Beyond this, Vanessa also looks at the nexus of migration, religion, and secularism, at post-colonial approaches to forms of difference, and at love and intimacy. Our focus today, however, is not simply on this book. As the title of the series suggests, we are interested in cultivating a wider dialogue, sharing ideas and debating relevant issues. And so in this light, I am very excited to welcome two world-class thinkers on the politics of migration, diversity, civil society, and inequality, Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez and Anya Weiss, who are joining us from the University of Duisburg-Essen and from Goethe University Frankfurt, respectively. Encarnacion has long examined how global inequalities take local form, in Germany and beyond. She has made wide-ranging contributions to feminist and social theory around themes including coloniality, feminist and queer ways of knowing, and power. Encarnacion is also a seasoned activist herself, having played a role in the migrant feminist group Femigra. Encarnacion is joining us on the screen. And with us in person, we have Anya, who's likewise concerned with global and transnational inequalities, as well as with the forces that shape socialization, identities, and forms of difference. Anya has made important theoretical contributions to understanding the interplay of the global and the local, as well as in understanding how racialized inequalities are institutionalized by citizenship regimes. Anya currently leads a project investigating how the German police have changed in relation to migration and diversity. Finally, I should introduce myself. I am Farhan Simanani, and I will be your host and moderator for this discussion. I'm also a researcher here at the Institute, and my work explores how community organizers in the UK work to build common cause among diverse groups. Please join me in welcoming all our panelists today. To start us off, I want to invite Sanja to provide a short introduction to the book and to the work of the ZOMIDI team. Then, from here, we're going to have a broader discussion, a bit like a talk show, where we talk about the relationship between migration, diversification on the one hand, and civil society on the other. Sanja.
Thank you so much, and welcome online and offline to our book launch and panel discussion. The background to the debate today is the publication of the book that Farhan already mentioned. It's called Organisationaler Wandel durch Migration, Fragezeichen, zur Diversität in der Zivilgesellschaft, in English, Organizational Change Through Migration, question mark, on diversity in civil society. The book presents results of a research project conducted here at the MPI in cooperation with colleagues from Munich and Berlin universities. Their names are listed here on the slide. Some of the co-authors are here, present, and online, hopefully too. I was a researcher in this team, and the German Federal Ministry for Education and Research funded the project. Our starting point was the observation that civil society organizations are immensely important players in contemporary European democratic societies. Scholarship has emphasized their multiple roles as advocates, providers of services, as infrastructure for participation, and as voice of specific interests and groups. And yet, the broad spectrum of mainstream organizations has yet received little attention in migration research. Do such organizations include people of immigrant and minority backgrounds? Do they represent their possibly somewhat specific interests and intervene in immigration and immigrant policy? Have such organizations adapted to the transformation of German society to a socioculturally heterogeneous society with more than a quarter of the population having immigrant backgrounds? How would one go about researching this? Out of the large and very heterogeneous field, the project presented here focused on organizations with a political agenda, advocacy, or interest organizations as they are commonly called. They, in particular, play a part in how well immigrant interests are articulated in the political debate. Further, we decided to focus on organizations that should be sensitive to disadvantage and minority status because they themselves exist to fight for the interests of a disadvantaged group. We decided to conduct detailed case studies of a small number of organizations and reconstruct their development since about 1990, their potential adjustment to the diversification of society, their reasoning, and their internal debates. The 4 organizations in our sample are leading actors in their respective fields. The Deutsche AIDS-Hilfe, German AIDS Support, is an umbrella organization with over 120 member organizations for and by people with HIV/AIDS. The Vereinte Dienstleistungsgewerkschaft Verdi is the largest trade union for employees in the service sector in Germany, created as a merger of more specialized unions. The Lebenshilfe, translated maybe as AIDS Support, is the largest German civil society organization in the field of disability and sees itself as a self-help association, political interest group, and service organization. Lastly, the civil rights organization Lesben- und Schwulenverband in Germany, the lesbian and gay organization in Germany, advocates for the rights of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender, and intersex people. It's important to emphasize that all 4 organizations cooperated with the research teams. They thus allowed us to overcome a major methodological challenge in this field of research. It is hardly possible to fully capture the developments and dynamics without access to documents of the organizations and the willingness of key members and officials to give interviews and open the field. This also creates connections and trust that require scholars to carefully avoid bias and that, on the other hand, allow feedback to the organizations and effect of our research on them. The key theme of the project is change, in German Wandel, or openness to diversity. This theme reflects the common saying that migration not only changes the migrants, but also the societies they come to live in. But do so-called host societies indeed change so easily and at similar speed across different institutions, milieus, and so on? Research into institutions and organizations has been more interested in the opposite, actually, in stagnation, persistence, inertia, the gendered organization, institutional racism, and so on. So what can the book contribute to a better understanding of change, of openness to immigration and immigrants, and its preconditions? We assumed that change actually occurs in 2 dimensions: internally, with regard to membership, personnel structures, and also externally, if you like, with regard to the demands voiced by the organizations and coalitions sought by them. So now you're waiting on this, I guess. What did we find? All 4 organizations nowadays intervene in migration and immigrant politics, and they seek to incorporate immigrant-specific interests in some form. This did not come about automatically, and the investigated organizations differ in various ways. First, in terms of timing and urgency. In particular, in the organization representing the interests of people with a disability, the immigration topic has only recently achieved a permanent place on the agenda, while for German trade unions, representation of immigrant workers has long been of concern. In gay and lesbian interest representation, solidarity across borders is well established. Still, there were debates about who should be responsible for immigrant interests: the migrants themselves, other welfare or interest organizations, or the 4 advocacy organizations themselves. Immigration-related politics compete with other issues for attention and resources. And the content of such policies may be controversial. Thus, in the gay and lesbian organization, voices were strong in the early 2000s that demanded engagement against supposed homophobia among Muslims and more selective naturalization policies to defend gay and lesbian rights. Beyond welcoming immigrant members, all four organizations struggle to develop intersectional policies. That is, to identify and address partly specific interests of their immigrant clientele and membership within the common cause. This seems easier for refugees and newcomers than for the second generation and members of racialized groups. In the trade union and the Lebenshilfe, the Life Aid, a universalist interest policy that emphasizes commonalities rather than differences is popular. Cooperation with dedicated migrant or ethnic minority organization remains fairly limited throughout. Authentic voices from within, essential for defining and articulating an intersectional profile, are generally still weak. All four organizations have now realized that it is desirable for them to have a sizable membership of people of immigrant background and to open up recruitment paths to paid employment and to elected positions in the organization to ensure immigrant and minority presence in such positions. But they have hardly succeeded in achieving such aims or even decided on steps how to proceed. Underrepresentation is at present typical and sometimes dramatic. Lack of strategy, helplessness, maybe lack of determination are more prevalent than resistance from within the organizations, although we heard voices opposing an alleged special treatment if targeted measures for immigrants were considered or implemented. I want to turn to structural changes now within the organizations, and there we found differing developments and decisions, surely not only one model. The project has worked with the hypothesis that immigrant interests are more likely to be pursued continuously if dedicated officials, board members, possibly departments are put in charge of that. This is still not generally the case for various reasons and with mixed experiences. We have also specifically looked into immigrant self-organization within or affiliated with the four organizations. Such groups exist in different forms with differing status in all four organizations. We find it plausible that such groups are crucial to allow reflection on minority experience in the organization, on interests and demands, and to create pressure for change. Organizations often hesitate to allow such substructures within and strive for cohesion. Further, individuals with immigrant background, if motivated to pursue group interests, can also choose to organize elsewhere. These are challenges for intersectional advocacy organizing. A few concluding remarks on drivers of openness. We believe that institutionalist research offers important insights, but that attention needs to be paid to the specifics of advocacy organizations and their extreme heterogeneity. Impulses for change came not necessarily from within, but expectations in the organizational field proved crucial factors. Advocacy organizations look in particular to those they want to influence, that is, often governments and parties. Internal advocacy from immigrant members, if organized efficiently, and dedicated officials or groups are surely important, but not always strong enough. Like other organizations, advocacy organizations respond if key interests are affected. Declining membership is one motivation for change. The existing membership, though, and this is specific, needs to be on board. Internal integration and strategic orientations are related to key identities of the organizations. Intersectionality may clash with universalism and be easier to achieve with a more plural organizational profile. Thank you for your attention, and I'm now really happy to discuss this further and broader with our panel now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sanya, for that rich presentation. I feel, I'm now going to do a little bit of an injustice to what you said by trying to sum it up or at least sum up a key argument really briefly, but it sounds like one of the central claims that you and your team have been making is that we often believe that migration and diversification are these sorts of huge transformative forces that sort of sweep through society. And you're arguing that in the case of civil society organizations, at least, and perhaps civil society more broadly, this is not the case, that the change that might occur is in fact very uneven and is heavily shaped by the sort of specific contexts of different organizations and different fields. So I thought I would start by testing that argument with our two guests and asking them what they thought of that claim. Anya, would you like to go first?
Well, new institutionalism talks of decoupling, and it seems that there is two kinds of decoupling in these organizations. It doesn't seem to be so important that they put up a facade and then do different practice from reading the book. But it does seem to be a matter of concern that they are decoupled from parts of the society that they strive to service and represent. And so there is a new meaning to decoupling that you can reach from reading your study.
Right. Encarnacion, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting to see, I would say, kind of more dominant dynamics in society, which in fact, it is a transculturalized society. It is a society that some call post-migration or post-migrational. And still, it's quite interesting on the level of organization and then the civil society organizations that we can observe similar kind of developments like on the level of parliamentary politics too. So I thought that was quite interesting to see. And I remember also the comments of some of the participants of your workshop and the frustration that they were also expressing. And I think I do share with them the frustration. And at the same time, I thought it's quite interesting because, of course, the study works with advocacy groups. It works with civil organization groups that have got already a standard in a way or have already a, let's say, more sedimented platform, while parallel actually though to those times that are being mentioned in the studies like the 90s, the beginning of the millennium. So you have a lot of other kind of groups that don't do appear in the study, that do appear partly in the LSVD, as groups that they need to address, and as groups that intervene, and groups that go that get into dialogue with the organization. But that would be also an interesting question, how the intervention of those groups transform also the civil society organizations. And I mean by those groups, the groups that are more autonomously organized or more organized by refugee migrants themselves.
Great. Yeah, that's a great question, and we might come back to that. But for the moment, you spoke of a sort of familiar sense of frustration. And I know you have experience as an activist yourself. So I was wondering if I could ask for your perspective on sort of the bigger picture as to how you thought migration and diversification have transformed German civil society as a whole. What do you think has shifted? What do you think some of the sticking points have been, and so on?
Well, I do think, of course, we're talking about different periods of migration, and the study is mainly engaging also with the migration that has to do after post-1945 society, so the so-called guest worker on the one side, and then also the migration in the 80s from Eastern Europe, and then later on also in the 90s, especially from non-European countries. And so I think that, of course, the society has been transformed throughout. And the interesting part is how then when you look at organizations, they seem to organize, or also in regard to the kind of distribution of sharing power positions, institutionalized power positions, they seem to be to organize along kind of notions of membership to German society. And it's quite interesting to see how at some point in the study they need to face it, or they are confronted by the fact that there are members in the society that have migration biographies, that have migration trajectories, and that becomes quite accentuated at the beginning of the millennium. So I thought it seems to me like there is a parallelism going on between what migrant groups have achieved and then how this kind of civil society organizations organize. And we don't see in them a kind of a different dynamic to the broader society, because we do have a kind of mirroring of the debates in the broader society in regard to acknowledging Germany as a country of immigration at the beginning of the millennium. And then when you look at the debates also like in LSVD, but also in Verdi, and even in the Aidshilfe, you see that there is, of course, an attempt to understand also a global South critique and a kind of post-colonial critique. So that I found quite interesting, that they mirror actually the development in society.
So that's a really fascinating claim, because if I understand you right, in some ways, while the research team has argued that organizational context and dynamics matter quite a lot, what you're saying is if we zoom out, there is actually a sort of more general pattern that we can identify, maybe with some lagging or some path dependency within there, but actually there is a general trend where the same sorts of processes are being mirrored or repeated across different contexts. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that the struggles in society by the groups that are intervening in the civil society organizations that are being mentioned, which are groups organized by migrants and refugees, that the voice actually the concerns quite early on. You can see it in Verdi, you can see it in LSVD. But when the organizations start really to think, okay, we need to change something, is connected very much to broader debates and how society start to think differently, like in more post-migrational terms, and how those organizations also start to do that. Though the study on Verdi shows that it's still a long path to go, and that the debates on quota for migrants, for example, are still being debated. So, and even the LSVD study shows that the kind of autonomy of BIPOC, of Black POC, people of color organizations and migrant refugees in the organization as autonomous subjects are still also a point of struggle. So you see that it has to do also with the kind of status quo that is being politically negotiated.
Right. I wonder if any of our other panelists would like to weigh in.
Well, I think that both explanations are not mutually exclusive. So I think the study shows that general trends are processed by the organizations, just as my colleague just pointed out, but then it also looks at how every single organization does so differently. And I think for an empirical study that is interesting, and also for how to intervene, it is interesting to take into account the logics and the vision of every individual organization. Maybe also against despair, it is makes sense to look at organizations that are maybe a bit better or more advanced in dealing with these concerns, and other organizations that might learn from them.
Right. And Vanessa and Sanya, you guys had experience studying different sorts of organizations, so maybe you could bring in some reflections on those differences as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to start. I think it's very true that civil society organizations cannot be seen as a whole, and they're very different in structure and differ in structure, and we also witnessed that in terms of the 4 organizations that we looked at. And I, for example, looked at the Lebenshilfe as a disability rights organization. And the structure is very different to, for example, the LSVD, that is sort of mainly an advocacy organization, whereas the Lebenshilfe was established sort of in the aftermath of the Nazi euthanasie program, so the strategic killing of disabled people in 58 by parents of children with a disability. So this is historically rooted also to provide care and provide life and dignity for their children. And then this organization expanded and now has a federal level, regional organizations and local organizations that are then consist of a dual kind of structure, so an enterprise and volunteers on the board. So that means that we have professionals and usually parents or relatives of people with a disability organizing this organization, and that is how we have to understand how migration is then incorporated. And of course, we differentiate migration in terms of the political agenda, the internal sort of incorporation of migrants, and also migrants as a target group for potential membership. But returning to the Lebenshilfe, I can say that size and structure of the organization matters, of course, but also history and the mission of the organization. So we're looking at migration. We have seen in our historical construction, for example, that in the 80s and 90s already, migrants and concerns of parents, migrant parents of disabled children, were already raising, those concerns were already raised in the newspapers, but they were not strategically taken up as an issue and put on the general agenda. And the CEO, for example, of the organization told us, well, it just did not become a major issue. And that has to be also understood in the dynamics and logics of this particular organization. Those are parents sort of largely of a non-migrant background who are largely concerned with the topic of disability, not seeing it as an intersectional category. So then migrants were basically present in terms of the service provision, but this topic did not reach the federal level or the advocacy level. And I think this second point is that to understand that in its mission of treating difference as normality. So the idea of the Lebenshilfe is it's normal to be different. So that doesn't necessarily look at individual, or the idea is not to look at individual groups, but actually treat society, have this vision to treat society as equal. But of course that may interfere with the incorporation of specific needs of migrants or people at the intersection of disability and migration.
I would say, yeah, to your arguments, thank you. That's for reading and analyzing and giving us feedback on that. And I think what we try and I think also accomplish doing in the book is to say what similarities are, but also how it is more complex. And I think therefore really detailed case studies were the perfect method to do that, because we also started out with the hypothesis that for example, German national migration politics would mirror actually in the civil society organizations, but they actually do not, or not in all of them, or it depends on the policies and it depends on the time. So they are not a mirror of all the migration politics that are going on in Germany, only sometimes, and I think we can explain that more in detail because they have different groups and different people and different interests in mind. That is one. And we can show more. And then you also hinted to migrant self-organizations and how they intervened in different fields, in different areas. And we can also show how they are a factor, but not the only factor. So I think we can show how an interplay of different factors builds constellations that are enabling change, that organizations actually pick it up, but in very different ways. Starting already by the fact that the organizations have very different groups in mind when they are thinking about migrants, or in the study of the LSVD, we also have shown that like different groups of migrants have been in the center, or different groups of migrants have self-mobilized, organized, and pushed forward their interests with different effects. And I think that's really interesting. And you pointed out the importance of size and structure of organizations. They are very different. Public administrations are somewhat maybe different, but work in similar ways. And here we have like structures that are grown in very specific ways. And I think the Verdi case is very interesting, because then if a new group or a new interest, a new issue comes, they can also use already pre-existing logics and structures. Like, for example, that you had a structure of so-called person groups, of women, of other groups already that had certain rights within the organization, in the decision-making and so on. Migrants could also use that approach and say, like, we want to have a seat at this table as a similar group too. Or, for example, there is a quota for women in Verdi, and then pushing also for a migrant quota there. In other organizations, there are no pre-existing structures, like in the LSVD, and then these groups sometimes are in a vague because there's no pre-existing logic or structure or group how this topic could be institutionalized within the organization. So I think like our book and our research shows like an interplay of these different factors.
There's a really interesting suggestion in what you're saying, Sanja, which is that, you know, there can almost be this sort of intersectional cascade effect, that if you build the right structures or kind of secure the right resources within an organization in order to support one group or a certain set of needs or a certain set of demands, that can also open up the possibility for supporting other groups at a sort of lower cost. Do you find that to be true, or is that sometimes only occurring in certain organizations?
We have very different decision-making and decision-building structures within these organizations. Also organizations that are like Verdi and Lebenshilfe are organizations that are way more complex than the LSVD, that is run as that also wants to be, that appears to be very big because they are very influential and very successful in their advocacy, but actually the structures are pretty tight and therefore efficient. So I think organizations also don't want to get too complex, and in Verdi too, that's an argument also. We don't want to add like more and more person groups because our structure is already so complex, so we can't be efficient anymore in our decision making. So that's a constant struggle these groups have, and in Verdi, migrants particularly, okay, we don't want a quota because that makes it too complex. So I think like there are different forces that play out against each other. Of course, there can be like a riding on like pre-existing structures, but I think it has limitations too.
So then a question for all of our panelists is, what, you know, if you had the sort of Christmas wish list, the magic wand, what sort of resources would you provide to civil society organizations, or what sorts of actors would you sort of try to bring in to kind of help make them more inclusive and more effective at incorporating diverse voices and diverse interests? Whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'm still at the point of why doesn't it work, and why is Encarnación's frustration justified? So if I may expand on that, you know, I do think that your frustration is justified, and I think the end of the book also shows this frustration of other interested parties and respondents. And I think what deserves more attention is that these organizations actually are not a mirror of society, even though we call them civil society organizations. But we know from basically all social movements that people who can spend some time in a social movement must have a certain degree of resources and self-esteem. And so we know that class struggles, that women's struggles, and also migrant representation is kind of leaning towards middle-class organization. And so I think that complicates the picture, and I think it's also part of an intersectional perspective. And I think basically in these organizations that have been observed, we still do see strongholds of the more white, non-migrant middle classes. And in the migrant organizations, we also often see a middle class self-organization. And there is some degree of competition also of people who want to enter established positions. And so that, I think that is part of why this is so frustrating, when you have organizations that are very progressive, very dedicated people, but at the same time they're still kind of established simply by being the resource-rich, educated part of their community. So the magic wand is something that I can't come up with right now.
Makes sense.
I don't know whether you agree with me on that, Encarnacion, or whether you think that's a wrong account. Oh, we can't hear you now, sorry.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Anya, and everyone for your insights and points that you're highlighting. I think, of course, the study looks at organizational structure, and they're very specific organizations, and they're quite different in regard to the history of emergence. Are you still there? Because now I see just
Yes.
Yeah.
myself.
We're with you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
So, like, as you said, Vanessa, the Lebenshilfe, how it established itself is totally different story than Verdi or LSVD, which established itself in 1990, so it's quite recent, or the Aidshilfe. And of course, the two have different forms of organizing and also structures of participation and decision making. I think what I find frustrating is rather on the broader level when we think about how we imagine the nation, or how we imagine the body of the nation. And so what the studies show, though, in this complexity, is that the body of the nation is not being interrogated from the start, and that clearly there is something happening. And it was part of our project that Pinar Tushuk and I did with the migrant feminism, to uncover the story of migrant feminism in Germany. That, of course, the activists, the people, the witnesses, know about it, but it's not in the broader common sense. And so what we see in these organizations, though even in LSVD and also in Verdi, Verdi was not Verdi itself, but the trade unions being part of Verdi, having, before Verdi was established, having a history also of a struggle where migrants play a prominent role in those struggles and strikes. So I would say that actually the fact that the body of the nation is more than what is the historiography or the official historiography of the nation, when we consider migration as a moment of transformation of the nation. That moment happened a long time ago, but actually it is quite clear that the nation has been changing in the last 50 years or longer in massive ways. And so the organizations that you're looking at, with the exception of the Lebenshilfe, they started in the 80s, 90s, or the millennium, they're starting at a point where the body of the nation of Germany is totally transculturalized. But what we see on the level of party, parliamentary politics, and that's what I mean, is mirror, not the policies of migration, but the way we culturally think about the nation is mirrored. So interesting, I found in the Lebenshilfe, that the Lebenshilfe, of course, it is an initiative of people that come together and establish the Lebenshilfe. And they don't seem to interrogate the kind of national body in which they are becoming an advocacy group, which is, of course, it wasn't their intention, it's not part of their agenda or the program. But nonetheless, in this kind of trajectory, they encounter then the self-organized groups of Turkish families or other migrant families caring for the children and becoming part of the Lebenshilfe. And they initiate this process by being self-organized and probably with little funds. So, and then the organization needs to think about the body of the nation. And we have a similar process in LSVD. I would say Verdi is kind of different, is not the same. In Verdi, I would say that the struggle is more confrontational because you have outspoken groups and activists for a really long time, since the 1970s, I would say, transforming the trade unions and asking for participation, for decision-making. And still, I just looked today again how the Vorstand of Verdi looks. And it's still a white German Vorstand. And of course, those things are frustrating. How power is being organized and how, despite the struggle of those groups and the presence and the visibility that they create, they're having such a hard time to become part of the leadership or the decision-making process. And I'm not sure if it has to do with class only. Of course, I would say if somebody like me that comes from a working class family get access to higher education, get access to a profession, I'm probably more visible than other persons trying to interfere and also make the voices in these structures. But I think it is more a kind of how the nation organizes itself, and then how it's being organized on the micro level, like in those organizations. So I would say that we actually need to listen more to each other. I mean, the ones that are doing the work for a really long time, and we need to distribute the funding differently in order to enable also the cooperation between those organizations. So it is frustrating to see that in Verdi, to get a quota for migrants seems to be a difficult or a hurdle, while of course we need to say they have a quota for women because there were a strong women's struggle, but there is also a migrant struggle or a struggle of different migrant organizations and refugee and BIPOC organizations. So the question is still remains, why is it taking so long at a time where we're talking about post-migration society?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, 100% with what you said, and I think we actually witnessed that in our study, for example, that some people are not too concerned that the civil society organization, in my case or in my study, Lebenshilfe, is a reflection of society, and that they are largely concerned, or that some people within the organization are concerned with disability, and this is their approach. So they don't necessarily, or some inside the organizations don't necessarily see themselves as part of a larger movement, social movement, civil rights movement for social justice. And ultimately, I think it's addressing the what you say, the body of the nation is how to, you know, acquire social justice within those civil society organizations. And I think what happens at Lebenshilfe, for example, is that the focus is on disability, or sometimes the focus is on disability, and then what people describe in Germany as a pillarization or like Versäulung of difference, that different differences or groups that struggle for recognition are not necessarily creating allies with each other. And I think in the field of disability, that's very visible. And and it happens exactly what you described, that the board members are largely non-migrant German middle class who run those boards, who have the knowledge and the habitus to actually coordinate and the time and resources to do that. Yeah.
And coming back to Anya's point on class, I'm hearing something sort of not about class on an individual level. You know, Encarnacion, you were talking about, you know, how would a working class person in an organization be recognized, but almost class on a sort of structural level, where it sounds like one of the tensions here is that the ways in which civil society organizations and their members can sort of garner political recognition and make political claims is quite classed. And it sounds like one of the things that's not being contested are sort of the models of national belonging and citizenship that actually reproduce the efficacy of civil society organizations as they are today, and that people are maybe not interested in contesting this. So they want inclusion without necessarily challenging the foundations of political inclusion, political claim making on a larger scale. Is that sort of where you were driving?
Well, yes, I think just from an analytical perspective, it makes sense to be aware of this resource problem also applying to those who become activists in civil society organizations. I mean, you mentioned before that the people who are activists in the disability scene, they are hard-pressed for time, so they, you know, it kind of also makes sense for them to do less politics and stuff like that. And so there is this resource issue, but then I can also see Encarnacion's point that, of course, the imaginaries are also important, and you focus on the nation's imaginaries or the huge imaginaries, and I think the study also showed the smaller imaginaries within the organizations and how they intertwine, you know. And just before we started this, we also talked about the Lebenshilfe, you know, coming out of a very distinct historic situation when the people who founded the Lebenshilfe knew people who had been killed by the Nazis for being disabled, and they were worried about the life their children would have, and they were worried about the life their children would have, you know, not other things, you know. And so in that historic situation, it's a very specific situation, and in that case, the nation's body is very different than what we think about it today. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to move on a little bit and ask a question to all of you. We're talking about whether advocacy organizations can be intersectional, but what does this key term, intersectionality, what does it mean to be intersectional to each of you, and why is it important?
Well, if I may follow up on this, I think it is important to see that the people who speak for a certain group are not always identical with the group they represent. And ideally, they do a good job. In some cases, they are also, you know, making their living off of being representatives. And I myself am a relative of a handicapped person, and my relationship to the Lebenshilfe is, to say it euphemistically, ambivalent, because it's a very old organization with very, you can't change much. You know, so it's like, it's also, as an organization, it's both a very important advocacy organization. On the other hand, it's also a place where people have jobs. And I noticed in your case study, a lot of the changes came about when people retired. Yeah. So I think it's, you know, it's important, you know, when you have an intersectional perspective to look at the symbolic struggle and the big ideas, but to also look at the organizational demographics and the people who do their job and then retire, and to maybe balance both. That's how I would go about it.
Right. Thank you.
But just a quick comment on that, I would say, like, we often think of change as a linear process, and I think our studies really show that those organizations try something, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes it is followed up upon, and sometimes it isn't. You know, and I think we also had to rethink our way of thinking about change during that study.
And talking of magic wands, that seems to be an important take-home point that we all know about, this problem with the project driven innovation and the pilot projects. And there is tons of very good projects that are then discontinued. And of course, you can't continue every good project. But that it's self-evident that innovation has to start as a pilot project, and that no one thinks about how the pilot project becomes stabilized. I think that is something that needs further attention by policymakers.
Right. Sticking with our current question, Sanja, intersectionality, what does it mean to you?
I think it means the working together of different forms of discrimination, oppression, creating the specific problems, issues, dilemmas, but also maybe identities people identify with. And then I think, what is the intersectionality we talk about? And today we talk about migration-driven diversity, and there we see a broad variety. I think also the category of women and every other category is also contested, but specifically migration, we see that people use very different terms to mobilize and organize around. That changes and shifts, and that has also implications in terms of loss of organizational memory, or maybe also coalition building, or also that people maybe feel connected to people doing similar work in different organizations, and that shifts within the organization. In the LSVD first, you have binational couples organizing. There you have a relationship status within this group advocating for change because the citizenship law didn't allow the partners to stay in Germany. So these groups dissolved, for example, when the partnership agreement came into being, and kind of these were off. And then you had groups like Greek gays and lesbians, Turkish gays and lesbians organizing around a common language, around a common country of origin or other categories. Now you have a group of queer refugees, so it also shifts, and then makes it difficult. Or in the LGBTIQ area, people using labels like Black, Indigenous, POC, so that shifts. And also what we haven't addressed, that there's also an overlap of tackling migration and racism, and there's an overlap in who the people are making this an issue, bringing this up, or tackling that. And there's also sometimes a confusion that makes it difficult, I think. So I think it's, we don't talk about just one intersectionality here, but of many different ones that are addressed specifically and also come up at different times in these organizations, because these are very specific issues. And I think an intersectional lens helps us as researchers seeing these issues, but also helps the organizations, and whether or not these organizations also use kind of an intersectional lens to analyze or reflect on their agenda or on their membership. We can also observe different things. What we have seen is that, for example, a lot of organizations also don't know a lot about their organization. They don't know a lot about their membership, for example. And it's also a political question whether or not they want to know.
And I suppose, with what Sanja already has said, I think going back to the idea of intersectionality is the political agenda of intersectionality is to look at disadvantaged groups and at the intersection of differences that actually create a specific situation of disadvantage and discrimination. And also, I think, originally, going back to Kimberly Crenshaw and also everything Encarnacion has written, I think it is important to see that what is behind it is also an intervention in privilege and status, and ultimately also of whiteness, questioning how the status of people by actually looking at different forms of discrimination as a matter of social justice. And I would say in the organizations, for example, looking at it from an intersectional lens, not all the organizations use this language of intersectionality. Sometimes they apply it, sometimes they don't. For example, in the case of disability is often not seen as an intersectional category, but as one that is disability, not intersecting necessarily with gender, class, race, religion, age, that it usually always does. And I think that is to me that is important, because that allows to see the individual and individual groups inside organizations and society in their needs, in their specific needs, in their marginalizations, in their specific form of being discriminated inside society in order to cater for their needs, but also to improve the situation, really.
Encarnacion, do you have some
Yeah,
thoughts?
thank you. Thank you all for sharing your observations. Um, just to the study, I think the study is quite interesting because it shows actually this process of transformation in the civil organizations, and I do agree that of course there are different points in which the organization tries to address the issues that come up, and then there are again times where there are it ends and or it's blocked. And I find, not for the study that you've done, but maybe for future study, I would be interesting in why, for example, in LSVD, when you have the Greek and the Turkish and then the refugees actually organizing, then the funding is not being continued, or the organization doesn't think maybe we need to have some members of those groups in positions of decision making, in positions of also conceptualizing and also shaping the organization. And that those questions are also for the other civil society organizations the study look at. So what happened that when somebody is supposed to take the leadership that is not part of the group that is the regular group that gets a guarantee for leading, um, creates a lot of suspicion, or creates a lot of, well, this person is not yet prepared, to do that. And I think that very often members of those minoritized groups or racialized groups or migrantized groups don't get this guarantee, or don't get this ticket of saying, okay, you can now lead the organization together, or maybe we do have a Vorstand that is totally differently composed than it is at the moment, where most members are represented by the hegemonic group in society. So I think that the organizations need to do this step. Not only the organizations, but the society need to do this step, um, to start to think more in relation to different actors and to different groups, and see this complexity of composition of the nation state, and I mean the national society itself. So I think to say intersectional is maybe not fully what it might capture it, or say, oh, we need to think about diversity. We need to complicate actually how we perceive this national body, how we perceive society, and how we perceive groups and subjects in it. And I mean, I always refer to the lesbian Afro-American feminist collective in Boston, Combahee River Collective, that always talk about the interlocking system of oppression, or we could say interlocking system of social inequalities or violence also, that create these positionalities of exclusion or marginalization or disadvantage, that are crossed by different dimensions of inequality and dimensions of subalternization, we could say, that have to do with gender or sexuality or race or nation and so on. So it's not so much, I think, when we say, oh, let's be intersectional, of course, it's difficult to say, let's be intersectional as such. I think we rather need to look, I think it would maybe be interesting to do, and I assume it's a question I have to Sania and Vanessa and the project, what are your future ideas? Are you working with those organizations? Are you continuing working with them? Are you thinking of doing a workshop? Because it would be interesting to try to foreground also these actors that come from this migration, refugee context, and try to have really a dialogue. Why didn't worked out? You know, why didn't the LSVD try to regroup itself differently on the little leadership position? Or a workshop on why is Verdi not so keen on the quota for migrants, and really organize and invite those actors and open those organizations to have this discussions. And what I like to say, of course, the organization are side of political struggle. They're sides of different groups with different interests. And of course, there are a lot of antagonisms that they're struggling with. And and so I think it's interesting also to see how this aims that appear, these political claims in those organizations, how they could be follow up. I mean, this is also a question I have to the project.
I think, Matt, that hints also to the bigger question: what is the task of science and research, right, and academia, and how does that translate? And we have thought about that and reflected about that also a lot on this relationship. And I think it is really interesting that this kind of research we did, where we actually didn't go in to interview 3 people and went out, but actually accompanied these organizations for quite some time and were in really close contact with them and had many meetings and discussions. I think like us already just asking questions and bringing this up were definitely impulses into the organizations. And for example, in the case of the Lebenshilfe, they also then did like a survey within the Lebenshilfe, so they actually found out more quantitative information that also the organization is using. So I think like there's definitely that was already an impulse asking these questions and bringing that up. And I think maybe also because a lot of the viewers might not know these organizations as well as you do, or unfortunately maybe haven't had the chance to read the book, although it's open access, so you can all read it for free. It is interesting in the case of the LSVD. Of course, I think it's important to tackle the questions: what did not work? Why did these groups disappear? But I think the answers are not so easy as one might think. Like some of these groups dissolved because they actually successfully achieved their mission. Like some of the Greek gays, for example, they founded a similar organization in Greece, left Germany and successfully started another organization. Other people, so the goals and aims of the people organizing were also very different. And at the same time, I totally agree, these questions have to be posed. And then in the situation, in the case of the queer refugees right now, they don't get any funding anymore. No funding in this case means you have really underprivileged people who don't have the financial resources to buy train tickets, who are not in a safe place that they could Zoom from the refugee shelters. So resources are needed, but the funding is out. And then, of course, the question is, like, are organizations able to or willing to provide these resources that this can go on or not? And then I think it's really interesting to look at all the, that is always very ambivalent. Like in the LSVD, on the one side, you could say they don't provide enough resources. On the other side, they give them like a certain number of resources and are like also, okay, you are also free to organize outside the LSVD or within, you are free to decide what you want to do. But this freedom creates also a lot of insecurity for the people there, what to do and how to move forward, not to have like a predefined structure, what to do next.
I think just to add what you said, I think the follow-up is, of course, we have. I think the ideal would be to bring all those people to the table and actually say, like, what's the problem with moving forward? That's not always not so easy methodologically, but also in terms of political ideas. But I have to say, like, for example, in our case, working with the Lebenshilfe, that was a very constructive and productive process, because they were very upon our research, they were very willing to open up and discuss our results with us, and actually acknowledge that it's right, we need to do something. And I think that is really, in a way, if you can say that, a success story in terms of a dialogue between civil society organizations and academia that not often doesn't happen in that way. And they have created a permanent unit for migration in the federal office now, and really follow up on this idea to do something. That doesn't solve a lot of the problems that we identified. You know, the board members are still the same, and I think there's still a lot to do, and there's justified frustration still. But I think this is the sort of the way to move forward in keeping and being in dialogue with those organizations. And yeah, we were also lucky that they were cooperative and cooperated with us in that way on a very trustful level.
And also,
sorry.
if I can jump in and just add something, I think it is also being in this research team and then talking to many people, I think it is striking that I got a lot of feedback like, yeah, I know from other cases where migrants tried to organize and then it didn't work out. And I think there are like structural reasons behind that, and I think that has to be addressed, because these are not just single cases. It happened, and it happens quite often, and I think like that is important to look at. And at the same time, I think migration is actually one of the main topics that LSVD worked on in the last 30 years compared to, for example, other issues. And I think like that's a bigger question, how in a society where people perceive themselves more and more individual, where like identifications multiply and intersections multiply, how organizations hold this together, because we are only talking right now about migration-driven diversity right now, but I think it's also a big challenge, and I think like organizations need answer to that in the future too.
This is a super interesting discussion, and I'm a little sad to wrap it up, but I'm quite keen to have some time for questions from the audience and our online audience as well. And so I'm going to sort of stick a pin in this with a reflection, and then maybe if there is time, we can come back around to it. And the reflection is, Encarnacion, going back to your description of civil society organizations as sites of power struggle, sites of conflict, you know. I think there's an interesting challenge actually for us as scholars of these organizations and of sort of society more generally, where there's two different kind of things going on in social theory, where, you know, it clearly, you know, the project team has illustrated, and as have you all in different ways, that organizational particularities are very important. But the language of sort of organizational studies, I think sometimes like path dependency, like slippage or something, can sort of abstract away from us attending to that more sort of visceral power struggle that can also occur within those same contexts. And so I think there's a challenge ahead of us in how can we start thinking about these things as intertwined, that organizational dynamics matter, that structure matters, that resources matters, but that these things are also fundamentally political in a very live and active way, and we don't want to sediment this in the language that we use. This has been really rich. I'm going to open to the floor, and then maybe we can come back to that if there's still time. So, questions, please. Yes. So it sounds like we've got something from our online audience, or a few things maybe. And I'd like to invite my colleague Tinashe to share those.
This is on? Okay, great. So there's one question here. Someone says, very interesting conversation, and thank you guys for sort of elaborating on this topic. And then the question is, how specific is this discussion to the German or Western European context and this approach to migration and diversity? And I suppose the question is really around how or what lessons can we sort of learn out of this discussion, and how can we apply them outside the Western European or German context? Thanks.
Well, I think the discussion has to be particular because it looks at very specific organizations in their geographic and historical context, but the question is still interesting because I just found myself wondering that we take it to be self-evident that organizations should deal with the representation of migration because the demographics of Germany have changed and the self-description of Germany as a country of immigration has changed. So that seems to be self-evident. Now, I happen to be interested in global inequalities, and we're all aware of climate change, and I've been thinking, will we in 30 years be asked whether we've been taking account of the fact that big regions of the world are drying up or drowning thanks to our ways of producing and consuming. Now, this is a thing that's just on the horizon. Now, since the Club of Rome 40 years ago, theoretically it's known, but it still hasn't reached really anyone in their organization. And so it is, of course, also particular how we do our research now. We take some things for granted. We take it to be self-evident that this is the matter at hand. And other observers looking from the outside may think, why do they take this to be so important? It's not directly answering to that question, but it's one answer.
Encarnacion, please.
Yeah, I do think, of course, there's some specificities, and I assume that Vanessa and Sanya would already illustrated them, and also the study does very specific to the German context. Even if you would look within Europe, you would do a comparative study between UK and Germany, you will find a lot of differences in regard how the nation imagine itself and how politics are organized around who is the body of the nation, and how the civil society groups also work within it. Or if you compare it to Spain again, because we have a specific historical context of nation building and also of migration and also colonial history. And I always look at migration as part also of this entanglement with colonial history. And the other part of migration as a site of control and also of management of migration. So of course, it's also very much about the nation's other and how this nation's other is imagined, but also politically regulated, and how hard it might become that this nation's other become actually that is there the whole time. It's working, it's having children, it's being part of that society, it's contributing to the social reproduction of that society on many levels. How this other is still being perceived as something that is outside the nation. And this question, I think, is a question that is interesting for also outside Europe. If we look, for example, at migration policies now in Colombia or in Chile or in Argentina and Brazil or in South Africa, we also have this tension there. Who is the body of the nation and who is the outside of the nation? And so the question I think that your studies also show is how this is always something that is in transformation, and it's in transformation and it has a presence that is actually, and you mentioned this, die Lebenshilfe, working with difference and the continuation of difference. So not the same becomes the center of negotiation, but also difference, and how do we deal with difference? And in this case, I think it's actually a question that is interesting for, outside also Europe, though migration policies and the whole managing and regulation of the others, of the nation's other, might differ from geographically and sociopolitically, depending where we look at.
Yes.
I think to expand on this, it's really all a question of democratic representation. And the one model is that everyone who lives in a country should be part of the nation and such part of the body that votes and decides and is part. But then when we have civil society groups, they are basically already responding to the fact that this is not the case even inside those who theoretically are part of the nation. Because depending on their status, they may find themselves to be outside of the nation. And in the end, only white middle-class men of a certain age are the nation. And so, And my personal view on this is that we should think more about modes of democracy that work beyond the nation. We've come to the sad acceptance that global affairs are best dealt with by experts such as ourselves, but I think that's really a democratic deficit that we should urgently attend to. And there are actually forms of democracy that are not exactly like a parliament. For example, in the German social insurance organizations, there's always a body of the people who are insured, and they kind of control the insurance. I've never seen something similar in North-South relations. There are huge groups of clients, and the organizations who deal with them always say, we are so benevolent, we always want to help the clients, we always talk with them, And there is a big representation problem. And I think we have a similar problem here, that groups have to organize as civil society organizations because they're not properly represented. And in doing so, they exclude others who are not properly represented, and sometimes themselves who are not properly represented. And I think it's a more fundamental problem of kinds of representation.
Right. Or the fact that democracy is defined by representation in the first place, rather than ownership or co-participation or these other possibilities, right? Yeah. Let's go Sanya first.
I think we try to, I would say both. I think if we use institutionalist theory, for example, or organizational sociology, I think there are certain factors where we would say they are maybe more general that would apply to organizations in different countries, in different contexts, on a very abstract level. But I think what we are trying to do here is to point out and I think that's what we're trying to do, to be more specific in detail, and also make the theory a little more to add something to the theory on a more universal level, so to say. But then obviously we also point to the specificities that are important. That civil societies look different in different countries, and also the role of organizations are very different, that the welfare states are different, that welfare organizations in Germany have a very specific role in this kind of corporatist model in Germany, or also unions are institutionalized differently in Germany than in other countries. So I would say both. I think we also use theory from other, that other colleagues developed in other contexts, and then also work here, and then we specify that. So I think the answer to that question is both.
And I think we have pointed out how, it's Germany specific as it's historically rooted, and how those trajectories go along in those civil society organizations. But I think there's something, as you said, very universal also to be analyzed. I mean, this kind of universalism versus particularism, for example, the idea, or can organizations be intersectional? I mean, there are other studies in other countries that suggest very similar, that civil society organizations or political movements struggle with intersectionality. For example, there's this study by Lépinard who refers to intersectional repertoires in feminist movements, and they're actually she identifies internal racisms and discriminations. So that's something we also find and can actually connect to, and that's not Germany specific apparently, because she looked at Canada and France. But I think there's something else we analyzed that is more universal, I suppose, that is organizations that deal with a particular difference are not necessarily inclusive in and of themselves, and struggle with that. And that's, I think, it's also a paradox of human beings, that human beings are not necessarily inclusive and build structures that are on hierarchies and power structures that are not necessarily inclusive, even though they strive for it.
That was the wind, folks. Continuing on.
Maybe that was my full stop. Yeah. So I think that's also a paradox that's not, hopefully not Germany specific.
Other questions from the audience, please?
I
Yes.
could follow up on this.
No, go on.
Because there is, you're absolutely right in what you say, and we all know it from experience. And I only recently came to understand in a dialogue with a political philosopher that there are other forms to organize politically. For example, when you have a pluralist party democracy, the whole system is organized so that you have to accommodate difference. And you need not love each other. You have to accommodate it. And I think the problem with advocacy groups is that they do need a shared identity. We know that. And so what we have to think about more is to create advocacy groups in a manner that has to accommodate difference. And there's a lot of it in your book, and also the comments and what the colleagues said, such as quotas, or such as, I like this one point very well, like when migrants organize around handicap, the funding comes from the integration funding. It should come from, at least partially, from the handicap, the disability funding, and stuff like that. So I think the challenge is to, the magic wand challenge is to think about how advocacy groups can organize around an identity, but still be kind of forced or committed or gain legitimacy by creating structures that force them to accommodate difference. And I think that should be the thing for the magic wand future.
Yeah, and reflecting on that and coming back to Encarnacion's, continual reminder about who is the body of the nation, right? I think, Vanessa, when you talk about, this challenge between universalism and particularism, one of the challenges of universalist templates of politics is that there's this aspiration to sort of be all-inclusive, to bring everybody up to a level of equality, but universalism always has to follow a sort of cultural paradigm. We have to say what it means to be equal, according to what terms, and there's always an outside to that. And so universalism always almost sneaks in through the back door this sort of threat of the other, of somebody who sort of threatens to degrade what it means to be equal, what it means to be a citizen according to the terms that we've established, right? And so difference almost within that paradigm that really aspires, often in a very honest and well-meaning way, I think, to empowerment and equality and so on, difference nonetheless becomes a threat, in certain guises at least. And it's a really interesting provocation to ask, what are the models of politics, whether for sort of states, nations, or civil society organizations, where difference is somehow generative, where it's productive, right? I think that's really, really rich. Thank you.
And I think we show in these cases, or we observed in these cases, that within the organizations, in their mission statements, in their self-understanding, in how they see themselves, there are different bridging narratives that I found really interesting to observe. For example, that unity through diversity is something that we observed in the trade union and also in the LSVD, with like very different meanings actually where it comes from. Like in the LSVD, diversity meant like diversity of lifestyles, because different kind of being gay, being lesbian, that was considered to be a strength, and that like research shows that this was like a very powerful move that made these movements very successful. And this kind of self-image can be used to then a different meaning to, for example, for instance, migration. And in Verdi, for example, too, that diversity was meant that people who worked in different branches of different industries, different areas of work, and then is reused or can be recycled or like transferred or translated into other areas too. So I think like these kind of bridging narratives are also very interesting, how different social movements or different civil society organizations also reuse their self-understanding to openness. But I also want to point out, I think I said it in the introduction too, we have 4 organizations who were open to that, and I think like we can't take that for granted either. So,
I'd just like to follow up in what Sanja said, because the Verdi example is quite interesting because it's actually being a worker, what organized actually the trade union. And also when you look at strikes, or if you look at other trade union campaigns and activities, you see what gets, the political subject is the workers or the workers' movement. And so there is an implicit kind of, we could say, internationalism or transnationalism in it. So the interesting question still, and I still think that the nation matters because migration policies are organized around nation and nation state. So though we might have notions that go beyond the nation on the level of democracy, on the level of how we imagine living together, like conviviality and other notions of thinking more in entangled ways and more transnational or more cosmopolitan, we could say. We still have a very factual way of organizing the nation and regulating the nation, and migration policies are part of it. So in regard to Verdi, I found interesting when then all of a sudden certain groups of the nation become then the ones that take the representational role, or the role, or are part of the committees of decision making. And so this is the same in other, even in LSVD, where you wonder what is happening when you have a political subject that goes beyond this kind of membership to the nation. And at the same time, when it comes to positions of decision making, when it comes to distribution of resources, then other factors play a role. And then you do have, again, a hegemonic representation in those organizations. So this question still, I think, is for me a very important one, especially now in 2022, where we have other organizations like the New German in Germany, organizations, and other, or the Center for Intersectional Justice, that are differently organized.
Right.
So there are other, let's say, other actors that already emerge from a different political trajectory and represent more this transcultural space of the nation.
Right. Yeah, that's such an interesting thread, and I'm afraid we're almost out of time. I'm just going to invite a final remark from any one of our panelists who might want to throw something in, if the train is leaving the station. But if we don't have anything, I'd like to. Oh, Sanja, yes, please.
I would say thank you to all the people listening in and watching and writing comments that we hopefully get to see. And please, thank you for taking the time and energy to read and discuss with us and getting your feedback. And we hope we get a lot more feedback and on the book. And thank you.
Well, and I would like to recommend reading the book because it really is a very good read and very interesting to read, especially not only for the big picture, but also for the case studies.
Right.
And maybe
yes.
And maybe I can add that, of course, people who worked with us on this study, Karen Schönwelder and Helen Beikarer-Krumme, and of course the whole team are involved, and it's really, I think, benefited from really rich and productive discussions among us as researchers, but also, of course, from the collaboration of and with the organizations.
Great.
So thank
Yeah,
you.
and I like to thank you for the invitation, and I also enjoy reading the book. I find it very interesting to look at organization and civil organizations, and I do think we need more of those studies also at the university. I would like to see the studies happening. Thank you.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking all of our panelists one last time for a great discussion, and we hope you have a lovely evening after this. Thanks.